Thanks, Senator Green. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for attending today. You got my questions in writing, Dr. Johnson. The first question was, please confirm whether you agree that any data adjustments need to be rigorous, independently replicable and accurately supported with metadata.
Senator, I might just ask my colleague, Dr. Stone, to take those questions. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Senator.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. The Bureau does agree that homogenisation adjustments need to be rigorous and homogenisation needs to be independently replicable using agreed peer-reviewed methods. But it doesn't actually need, it's not a requirement that it's supported by metadata, as you've suggested. The purpose of homogenisation is to adjust for discontinuities where they're detected, as I was describing earlier, in comparison with nearest neighbours. Metadata, such as documentary evidence of a site move, tells you that you might like to check for discontinuity, but it doesn't tell you to make the adjustments themselves. So adjustment occurs only where a discontinuity in observations crosses what I referred to earlier as a threshold of significance. So it's possible for homogenisation to occur without metadata, and it's also possible that metadata can describe a situation where there has been a change in observation practice, but homogenisation isn't required because that change doesn't result in a discontinuity in observation. So it's actually the discontinuity in observation that's critical in determinant of whether or not homogenisation occurs and the scale and direction of the change.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to just some. We've got data on many more, which are similar, but the Townsville weather station, according to the BOM's metadata, said it's had one move, whereas in fact it's had 8. The Rockhampton weather station has had, according to BOM, 1 move, whereas in fact it's had 4. The Cairns weather station has had, according to BOM, 2 moves. The facts are that it's moved 6 times. And the Charleville weather station, BOM says has moved twice and it's had 4 moves. Why did BOM and the various peer reviewers fail to detect and discuss these inaccuracies?
Sorry, I missed the last part.
Why did the Bureau of Meteorology and the various peer reviewers fail to detect and discuss these inaccuracies in the metadata?
Yeah, no, thank you. They're not inaccuracies in metadata. So the metadata either exists or it doesn't. And in the cases you've described, there are instances where a shift in the Met station has occurred and there's not metadata that describes that. So it's not actually an inaccuracy in the metadata. And I refer to what I was saying to earlier. Whether or not there's metadata doesn't impact on the integrity of the homogenisation process because it's actually looking for that discontinuity in observations that determines whether or not there is homogenisation that occurs.
But surely if there's data about the movement of stations and that data is inaccurate, then the metadata is wrong.
No, in this case, the metadata is not present. It would be wrong if it said that there was a shift and there wasn't one. What you're describing is where a change hasn't been recorded, so there's not metadata that relates to it.
Right.
There's a difference.
So the BOM's claim that it's moved once in Townsville, the weather station moved once, is not accurate because it's been moved 8 times.
Sorry, we don't claim it's been moved once. We have metadata that shows that it was moved once.
Okay.
Yeah, so we wouldn't claim that there haven't been shifts if we don't have the data.
So you've got metadata for only 1 move, whereas in fact we know it's been 8 moves.
We have metadata for Townsville. I'm sorry, I can't tell you how many of those that we have metadata for, but the principle remains the same. There are instances in the historical record where there have been changes made and they weren't recorded at the time.
Right. So what are the consequences of these errors specifically in terms of recording weather data such as temperature?
Yeah, they're not errors. I just want to be clear about that. So the presence or absence of metadata doesn't imply an error.
If the station's been moved and it hasn't been noted in the metadata, then it's not even recognised.
Correct. But if we're talking about the impact of that on the homogenisation process, it doesn't result in an error because homogenisation only occurs where there's a statistical discontinuity in the data detected. So you can have moves that don't result in homogenisation being triggered, whether or not there's metadata, and vice versa. So I can be crystal clear, it doesn't result in inaccuracies in our estimation of climate trends if there's metadata or not.
Has BOM done any analysis to quantify the effects of the station moves, especially the ones it didn't know about?
No, absolutely. So as I say, the process of homogenisation actually looks back through the records for a given station, looks for a discontinuity in measurements compared with nearest neighbours. So it steps through and does that. So a high proportion of the homogenisation changes that are made aren't triggered by metadata. They're triggered by, as I mentioned, a discontinuity in the observations. And that's determined by comparing with a large number of nearest neighbours, which we can do with temperature, because temperature is reasonably conservative across geographic space. And it's why, for example, you can't really homogenise for rainfall, because it's much more spatially variable.
So do you have any more questions?
Yes, I've got a couple of more questions, Chair. You said you've been able to analyse these past records. Could you please provide for each of the 4 sites that I've mentioned, that's Townsville, Rockhampton, Cairns and Charleville, the quantified analysis the Bureau of Meteorology has done and document the independent peer review process used?
Absolutely.
Just on notice, please.
That's all on the website. Yep, no problem.
Thank you. Last pair of questions, Chair. What are the specific quantified consequences of BOM's inaccuracies on CSIRO's use of BOM data? I'm particularly interested because CSIRO has admitted to me that it does no due diligence of its own on temperature data that it merely accepts from the Bureau of Meteorology.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. As I described, the presence or absence of metadata doesn't result in inaccuracies in the homogenisation process. So inaccuracies have not been passed on to CSIRO or any other user because of concerns about metadata. It's fundamentally a statistical process.
What are the consequences on the government policy and the general assumption that Australian temperatures are increasing?
Yeah, as I say, so if the question is about the accuracy or otherwise of the estimates, presence or absence of metadata isn't material. And, I can confirm, the global trend for warming is around 1.1 degrees Celsius since the pre-industrial period.
And when you say pre-industrial, what year?
1850.
Thank you.
That's
just the end of the Little Ice Age.
What I'm seeking to do is describe the difference between the global trend, the homogenised trend and the raw observation trends. So the global trend is around 1.1. The unadjusted trend is 0.95 degrees Celsius, plus or minus 0.24 over the same period. And the homogenised trend is 1.44 plus or minus 0.24. So neither the raw nor the homogenised trend differ from significantly from the estimate of the global trend.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware, just by coincidence, that CSIRO has admitted to me that today's temperatures are not unprecedented? And then after it admitted that, it said that what is unprecedented is they claimed is the rate of recent rates of temperature rise. Yet the papers they gave us, not one of them shows that, and 2 of the papers show that rate of past temperature rise has been warmer than the recent temperature rise, which ended about 1995.
Yeah, no, thank you. I haven't seen the CSIRO papers or correspondence.
We'll have to have a chat.
Yeah.
Thank you.